Okay, so first of all, we've got Nathalie Cooke coming up, who is professor at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. She is a literary food historian, and her research and teaching focus is on the evolution of culinary and literary tastes in Canada and Europe. She is the founding editor of the journal Cuisine, Zine, and the Journal of Canadian Food Cultures from 2008, and editor of four books, including What's to Eat, Entries into Canadian Food History. She's also written four books, mostly recently one that is the basis of this talk today, which is Tastes and Traditions, A Journey Through Menu History, published by Reaktion Books. So I'm going to hand over to you, Nathalie, first of all, and I will see you all on the other side.
Thanks so much, Matt. So I'm going to try and share my screen and not my notes. Um, so cross your fingers as I do this.
Yeah,
There,
that's worked.
thumbs up. Okay. So thanks so much for inviting me to come and speak. And thanks everyone for showing up. It was fun to see the chat and to see that you're joining us from all over the world. So, menus are everyday objects. They're found in restaurants, cafes, even online. But they're also rich cultural documents. And today I'm going to talk about my book, Tastes and Traditions. And I'm going to ask essentially three questions. What is a menu? What information does it contain? And what does it do? And I think answers to these seemingly simple questions begin to unlock ways in which menus convey meaning to the diners of their day, as well as to those of us in later generations scrutinizing them. So think of ourselves as questioneers, to use Heston Blumenthal's wonderful phrase. And I call us belated readers. So the term menu comes from the Latin minutus, meaning small, finely divided, or detailed. And lists become increasingly important when in mid-19th century, the meal fashion turned away from the presentation of multiple dishes at the same time, what was known as service à la française or French service. Think of medieval feast tables with that bounty, on top of the table, to serving individual dishes to diners in sequence. And that's Russian service, or what we essentially experience today. Despite the multiple advantages of service à la Russe, including minimizing the time for hot foods to cool while on display on the table, cereal courses had the disadvantage of keeping food items hidden, prepared behind the closed doors of the kitchen. A menu's first responsibility, then, was to provide a preview of the foods available. Menus from the first restaurants of the late 18th century Paris did just this, offering long lists of food written on unadorned broadsheets. However, menus contain more than a simple list of foods. Design elements such as illustrations and font style hint at the full dining experience, of which food is only a small part. Descriptions of dishes, how they are named and in what language they are described, speak volumes about the fashions of the day. So in addition to being culinary documents, menus can be interviewed or deconstructed for evidence of social customs of their time. In addition to itemizing food items, menus also strategically position these options for particular effect. For example, on this 1800s Parisian menu, with a huge number of items that you won't be able to read on my screen, by the way, so don't even try, it seemingly provides a list of very matter-of-fact terms to identify the range of food options. Now, I can tell you that they're all in French except for two. And one question, when I looked at it closely, was why does plum pudding appear in English among the list of items categorized as entremets de douceur, in other words, sweet dishes? The only other dish named fully in English, by the way, is the anglicized beef steaks. Why evoke the pudding's British roots? Well, initially, we might suspect that it's given special prominence because of the Christmas pudding's iconic status. But this menu is from the early 1800s, and plum pudding only achieved its height of fame in mid-19th century by an association with Christmas in Charles Dickens' wonderful A Christmas Carol, 1843, and then reinforced by Eliza Acton's 1845 book, Modern Cookery. Perhaps one answer is that pudding was a distinctly British dish, one served on French tables, but never wholly and wholeheartedly embraced by French cuisine, a subtle distinction communicated through language choice. Curiously, plum pudding earns the same privilege of being transliterated in such French Canadian language books as our very popular Canadian Cuisinière Five Roses, in which the 75 or so other pudding recipes are titled with the anglicized word pudding, even the very British sounding pudding du Yorkshire. In other words, even this early Parisian menu strategically signposts the significance of plum pudding and positions itself as part of a long tradition of doing so. Menus, I am arguing today, do not always serve to clarify choices, but rather work to intrigue, mystify, engage, and allure. Menus are marketing documents. Part of what they do is first convince diners to sit at the table and be tempted by offerings, to be suggestible, as we sometimes now say. Here, for instance, is a fixed price menu from the Grande Brasserie Lorraine in Nancy, France, which showcases and is sponsored by the liqueur Comment Doré Cuisinier. The menu depicts a smiling satyr, take a look at the top left, helping himself to a bottle from the shelf, while another bottle appears on the left, notice with its label clearly showing. And this 1899 menu makes explicit that the banquet for the jury members of the musical competition for the Société Charitable des Fêtes Rochelaises is sponsored by the herbal liqueur Benedictine, a bottle of which is being served to the elegantly dressed diners pictured, and another displayed by a small cherubic figure on the menu's left banner. These two template menus demonstrate the possible and mutually beneficial relationships that could be struck between product vendors who produce these elegant menus and restaurants in pursuit of customers, but without the cash to pay for such lavish graphics. What can alert us to the menu's strategic aims? Well, first watch for unusual terms in menus, boxes highlighting particular items, and specifically the color red. Menu engineers of about the 1960s are very aware of the typical line of your site when perusing a menu. They tell us to think of the typical movement of your eye as following a reversed Z shape on a two-page menu. So starting at the top right of the page, for example, on a one-page menu, one's eye likely starts at the 10 o'clock position and then moves to the top right of the page. I was going to say I invite you, but I dare you to consider this the next time you're looking at a menu and see if you can avoid your eye following this particular trajectory. For example, here's a 1960s menu from the Italian Garden, which is a wonderful textbook example of menu engineering techniques. What are you likely to order here? Well, think of the reverse Z pattern. Likely you'll start at the top right, where you're going to see some of the most expensive things on this menu, steak. Then your eye is going to travel to the top left, as you're hopefully looking for things that are less expensive, and you'll find spaghetti and pizza, followed eventually by baked lasagna as you zoom down. Notice also as you zoom down the very solid red blocks down at the bottom of the page, which are trying to get your attention, even though that's not where your eye is first going to start, right? In the center of the two-page spread, you have cocktails, not really drawing your attention despite the larger font and a box frame. And then always the sad guests at the party, eggs, chicken, and liver. They don't really get much of the menu's prime real estate, do you? Do they? Poor old liver, always the last on the list. So we've spoken about what menus do, convince you to enter, order, and enjoy. But what about when they decline to provide information or deliberately mislead you or tease you with misleading and curious information? I'm going to offer you 3 examples. First, consider this curious menu for an outdoor picnic luncheon. It's entitled, romantically, Déjeuner sur l'herbe. Although it's dated 1830, when I looked closely, the printing house indicated on the menu, Stern, didn't actually open until 4 years later, in 1834. And the artist of the drawing, Henri Morin, a French impressionist and modernist known for his watercolor paintings, was born only 43 years after this menu was dated. And the well-known painting of the same name, Déjeuner sur l'herbe, actually dates to 1863. So this curious menu seems to be for a historical meal, but the one that seems metaphorical and most likely fictional. The picnicking couple, for example, is dressed in fashionable clothes of the 1830s, and their mode of transportation, a horse and carriage, seems appropriate for the period. But the meal's courses seem to point to a narrative structure. Prologue, it begins, résistance, rather than the more typical course known as relever, or remove, and pour la fin, to end. Excuse my Quebecois accent here. You can tell I'm not from France, right? Curiously, the wines accompanying the meal are bizarre, to say the least. Huile de Vénus, oil of Venus, or beaucoup de bonne humeur, which would literally be translated as lots of good humor. So after thinking about this a bit, I soon realized that this menu was likely not a menu at all, possibly an illustration for a storybook or a kind of story written in a way to engage. My second example of a misleading historical menu is one for a gala dinner at the London Carlton restaurant in June 1902. Now, this is a menu I expect you've seen. It's frequently reproduced, both because it speaks to a pivotal moment in multiple histories and because of its various components were chosen with such care that they reward close scrutiny. This is the menu equivalent of a wonderful novel publication. But the menu's evidence is misleading, and more than half the books that mention it seem to overlook or are unaware of the events as they unfolded. Now, in 1902, the renowned chef Auguste Escoffier ran the kitchens of the Carlton Hotel, while his long-term business associate César Ritz ran the hotel. This menu was conceived by Escoffier to honor a beloved gourmand, their loyal customer, who was to be crowned Edward VII, King of England, on the 26th of June, 1902, the date of this menu. Although the king himself would not be present at the gala meal, many of those invited who journeyed to London to attend the coronation would be staying at the Carlton, and a number among the distinguished guests. Ritz had convinced those with rooms facing Pall Mall, where the royal parade would take place, to actually allow others to join them, to view the spectacle on their balcony, right? The menu signals its dedication to Edouard in a number of ways. It features something called the Poularde Edouard Set, a chicken dish named in the king's honor. But Escoffier's most famous dish was probably something called pêche melba, a peach dessert first served in an ice swan in 1893 and named for the Australian opera singer Nellie Melba. For this occasion, we see something called pêche Alexandra, peaches poached in kirsch and maraschino liqueurs with vanilla cream and strawberry puree, but named to honor Alexandra of Denmark, Edward's wife, rather than Nellie Melba. However, famously and tragically, the meal was not to be. Edward VII fell ill before the coronation and underwent surgery for appendicitis. So the date written by Escoffier on the top left of this menu is actually the date on which the gala had to be cancelled rather than the date the meal was held. César Ritz famously made the worrying announcement to those gathered for lunch at the Carlton on the 24th of June before collapsing from such nervous exhaustion that he never fully recovered. Escoffier would take over running the hotel and eventually hold another gala meal for Edward VII in August 1902. So to whom then does Escoffier dedicate the menu in this collection with his handwritten inscription, "À mon caillou"? We in Quebec are perhaps uniquely positioned to answer this question, which hasn't been answered to date, actually. While caillou literally means a pebble or a rock in French, the phrase is often used as an endearment for someone without hair. Here in Quebec, we're familiar with the children's books and the television show called Le Petit Caillou, right? Which is about a bald little boy before his hair grows in. Could this possibly be a dedication to the balding Edward VII, wishing him well on the day of his medical intervention? For my third example of menus that withhold information, let me turn to some menus intended to bemuse and befuddle, engaging curious diners precisely by distancing them from the information they presumably seek. A handwritten manuscript by Eliza Smithson from the 1800s, held at McGill in Montreal, contains a table setting diagram in which all the dishes are presented as riddles. What Adam gave Eve, for example, a spare rib, while a baronet represents sirloin. Since my initial discovery of this riddling menu, I've uncovered many more of what seem to be known as enigmatical bills of fare. Admittedly, my growing corpus of over 1,500 examples continues to produce more questions than answers. It's clear that many manuscripts were circulated and copied among coteries. Some have served as menus at the dinner table, and others have actually served as invitations, being circulated by hand and sometimes in print. Some satirists, such as William Heath, Thomas Rowlandson, and Woodward from the early 19th century, used the visual enigmatical bill of fare for comic effect. These enigmatical bills of fare and other riddles are clearly meant for entertainment. Large illustrated books would be rented by those hosting an evening event so as to wow their guests, rather in the way that pineapples used to be rented to wow guests. So despite the lack of contextual information about British enigmatical bills of fare, newspapers of the 19th and 20th centuries tell us about a sister phenomena, something called conundrum socials. So the Chicago Times-Herald describes the practice. The plan is to serve a supper à la carte, presenting the bewildered guest with a menu card written in enigma. From this, he must order at random, eating, of course, what's received. Throughout the 19th century, these conundrum-containing menus spread across the North American continent. So rather like the amusing British satires at turn of the century, conundrum events were intended to entertain. Now I'm going to briefly go through some visual menus here. So some menus assert themselves because they are absolutely beautiful to look at. And here I'm looking at a menu that was signed by the French portraitist for Les Cent Bibliophiles. This was a literary society which boasted literary publications like Baudelaire's Fleurs du Mal or Émile Zola's Germinal. This one has actually as a menu item, it's fraise melba. And so we see the way that escoffier dish has come down to different kinds of banquets and diners. This one is another one for les sans bibliophiles. It's called les bas, meaning the sock or the stocking. And so it's pointing your attention to the bottom right, even though the menu items are on the left. Now, I'm not going to go in detail over this menu, but I wanted to show you that there's some interesting menus for clubs that we don't know much about. This is for the 13 Club, which was actually organized to defy the general practice of not seating 13 at a table. And all of those who come to the 13 Club are willing to not throw salt over their shoulder to defy superstition. The 13 Club, like the Savage Club, has a number of menus in different collections. So I'm going to stop here and say that I hope this whirlwind tour through visual and textual artifacts of menus has piqued your interest. And I hope also, of course, that I'm going to pique your interest to dip into the book. We have over 190 illustrations in the book. So this is just giving you an appetizer, an amuse-gueule of what you might be able to see. Thanks so much.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Natalie. That was brilliant. I'm just going to pause the recording again. Okay, so thank you very much. We're now moving on to Mallory Cerkleski, who is a doctoral candidate in history at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa, Italy. She holds an MA in Food Innovation and Management from the University of Gastronomic Sciences and dual BA degrees in Sustainable Food Systems and Political Science from Guildford College. Her doctoral research focuses on the history of food rationing in India, examining how infrastructures of food provisioning shaped everyday life, political consciousness, and domestic labour across the 20th century. While no longer being a comparative project with Cuba, which I presume it was to begin with, she remains interested in that concept and memory of rationing in Cuba, and how that can inform cross-contextual understandings of food systems under communism. So she served as an adjunct professor at the University of Padova, teaching the course Italian Food and Wine History, and is a visiting scholar at the Centre for Development Studies in, I'm going to struggle to say this, for Uvanuphapuram in India. That's probably really destroyed that word, so apologies for that. And that was from February to April this year. Now she is studying as a visiting scholar at the South Asia Institute at the University of Heidelberg, and is a board member of the Graduate Association for Food Studies, a co-editor of the Graduate Journal of Food Studies, and the organizer and editor of the Culinary Chronicles Project book. So there's lots of things going on by the sounds of it for you, Mallory. So handing over to you.
Okay, thank you. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, it looks perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Super long bio. I didn't expect you to read the whole thing, but thank you. Thank you for organizing and having me, and thank you, Natalie, for starting this presentation off. Very beautiful presentation. Today I'll be kind of switching gears a bit, talking more about some nitty-gritty methods questions, and also diving into one side of my research, which is oral history. I also work closely in archives and looking through documents, but I'm doing some sort of multi-sensory history analysis, and a large part of my research has been oral history, and how to use food as a tool through oral history to understand memory and more subtle, everyday, mundane aspects of life across time periods. So yeah, so I'm just going to very casually talk about 3 projects that I've recently done, sort of display them, but also juxtapose them and explain the similarities and differences in working in different contexts. But all of them have a sort of shared understanding that as historians, of course, I am a contemporary historian. This or using oral history is generally in the context of the contemporary, but as that contemporary historians can use food and oral history to sort of analyze food as a cultural artifact, but also a medium for triggering memory and understanding personal narratives. But most importantly, my kind of aim of this presentation is to highlight the importance of fostering meaningful connections and relationships in the process. So since my time is limited, this is kind of the agenda. I'm just going to explain these projects, sort of reflect on some overlaps and intersections, and then we can also have time for questions since I will not be able to cover, everything in 15 minutes. So my first project began in Havana in the summer of 2022. I conducted 23 interviews exploring people's memories of food, justice, and future imaginaries under Cuban socialism. This work was very complicated, but also very beautiful. Cuba is an environment where people often want to say things without saying them, where language carries risk and weight. And food gave me another way in, an indirect but emotionally charged language for talking about the present and imagining something more. In turn, of course, also explaining the past, which is my goal. Like all my projects, I use a sort of oral history grid. Therefore, it's a flexible guide, not a script, proposing themes that will that people can sort of expand on however much or little they like. So my themes for this research were I always start in the present and go back in the past. So access, identity and tradition, socialism, and imagined futures. So sort of moving between time periods, allowing one to trigger others. And after a couple interviews, I also added a 5th theme that was kind of co-created with some participants, which was hope and perseverance. In many cases, people didn't feel comfortable directly speaking about politics, but when asked about daily meals, shortages, childhood snacks, or favorite recipes, complex histories, and sometimes quiet critiques began to emerge. So finding participants was informal, reaching out to people through context, but also weird, crazy means, and also in person. Interviews happen everywhere: parks, kitchens, balconies, and directly on the street if necessary. I rely heavily on being present beyond the formal interview and, of course, listening between words. This is a context where that's especially important. Language wasn't always fluent. I'm not a native Spanish speaker, let alone Cuban Spanish, which is even harder to grasp. But trust was built through shared meals, patience, and showing up, and also being honest about who I was and why I was there. So memory in this project was not about fact checking, but revealing truth through feeling, pauses, laughter, tears, and understanding how individuals have navigated and survived and dreamed within this complex system. And so in the end, I was able to gather many stories, to trace long histories, but also build relationships with people, which is the whole point of today. And I believe that when putting people first in the collection of history, of course, when it's possible, caveat also, I'm talking about the contemporary, you end up collecting people's histories in the way they remember them and want them to be told, which I'll also put a small caveat is not necessarily everyone's goal, but that can be one goal of writing some histories. Yeah. So this is one aspect of research I feel should always be emphasized, and especially as a foreigner trying to understand a society and history that's not directly mine. So I'd like to move on to the second project. This project, which we've now called Culinary Chronicles, so that's what I'll call it from now on, is sort of expanding beyond myself and trying to use the method of food within oral history and history collection in the world, let's say. But also the most important component was the aspect of community oral histories. So the person themselves being intimately tied to the person they're collecting the history from. So this project grew out of something very intimate. After being in Cuba and collecting so many stories from strangers, I realized I needed to do the same with my own family before it was too late. I started recording conversations with my grandmother, Yolanda, about her Italian-American upbringing, what she remembers eating, who was there, and why. I knew from my previous experience that asking someone what they ate in their childhood might seem casual at first, but will always open up something more. And that's exactly what happened. I was able to capture my family's story of migration, class, and gender dynamics in both small and specific memories of celebration and the mundane. That personal experience became the foundation for this project called Culinary Chronicles, which was a public oral history project turned into a book. So I put out a call for participants and people responded basically. So I gave workshops on food center oral history methods, interview grids, drawing exercises, and how to handle emotion and ethics, specifically with family members, which is another aspect to consider. And people went out and interviewed their elders in their communities. So this is the book cover. I can't see it myself, but I think you can see it in the table of contents. What came back was really amazing. Stories from across the globe, each one grounded in a food memory that opened into something bigger. Participants wrote about trauma. Ooh, I hope you can hear me because there's someone mowing the lawn.
You're perfectly fine. We can't
okay.
hear it.
Okay. So yeah, participants wrote about trauma, identity, loss, joy, migration, and more. After the project was over, we also had meetings to reflect on how the process influenced people and changed their understandings of their family and themselves. One participant, Serbi, reflected on the process of writing. She said it didn't end when she turned in the paper. It stayed with her in ongoing reflection. Another person, Gorish, interviewed his mother for the first time and said the process changed how he saw her story, but also his own history. Batuan, coming from political science, said that the project made him ask new questions. He recalled a time that I said to him, "Where are you in this paper?" And that became the prompt that he carries in his life. These contributions didn't just generate content, but spark dialogue in families and communities, and that was the point. Not about academic extraction, but instead about building something people could recognize themselves in. So moving on, the third project is my most recent project and of course my PhD project. So this took place in Kerala, a state in southern India. I was living there this past spring and now we're completely switching gears and completely, a new method for me, which was doing oral history in a language I did not just not speak, but also not understand a word of. So this was pretty incredible because I was forced to be supported by a wonderful team and community of people, which is also a sort of community oral history, not directly with family members, but I was kind of facilitating people, locals, collecting these oral histories with me, without me also. So I spent a lot of time being present in interviews as my collaborators spoke, and even though I couldn't always follow language directly, I could still read silences, gestures, smells, rhythms of what was happening. And in that space, food again became a translator, one that was able to transcend spoken word. Out of this, I was also decided to design a workshop that put me even more in the outskirts of the project and encouraged local people not working with me directly to collect and donate community oral histories. So the workshop was called Gather and Ground. It was 3-part workshop. So we basically yeah, I started with a sort of meeting space. We had some workshops on food, collecting oral histories, more practical ideas, more theoretical ideas, and then it ended in a community potluck where people brought dishes connected to the stories their families told them. And it was a very wonderful evening also of storytelling, about storytelling, and how these people learned new things about their family histories. And so now I would just like to briefly reflect on some overlaps across all 3 projects, whether it was with strangers in Kerala, community contributors from across the world, or people in Cuba. I found some key reflections. So in each case, food wasn't just the topic, but also the method, opening doors, disarming hesitation, and brought forward memories that might have not emerged otherwise. In all cases, I employ drawing exercises, which I find very interesting because it triggers another part of the brain. And in Cuba, I asked what their ideal food system can look like. I don't have time to go in the stories that people told about the photos, but they're all, the drawings, but they're all in my writing, so you can read them there. In Kerala, people drew a food map or a food memory. They were always different. Some offered utopian gardens, others communal kitchens, intergenerational tables of abundance. And actually for these drawings, I have the exact transcript of how people described the history of why they drew on my website. So as I share these projects with you today, I also want to invite us to sit with a series of questions that have guided my work, but also continue to shape how I think of food, memory, and storytelling in oral history. So I'll just read these questions for you and have you ponder them. So where do these stories belong, and what is the proper channel for communicating these voices with care and integrity they deserve? When can food truly function as a tool for connection and not a weapon of exclusion or control? What responsibility does the person collecting these histories carry, not just in gathering them, but in honoring, protecting, and interpreting them? How do we honor these stories without freezing them in place, without turning living memories into static artifacts? What does it really mean to share authorship with people whose memories we document, to approach this work not as extractive, but as collaborative? And of course, these questions don't have easy answers, but these are things that I'm thinking about all the time. And in each context, we'll have different answers too. So thank you. I'd like to hear from you guys and answer any questions you have. This is my contact information, so please feel free to contact me with any also very specific questions because I wasn't able to explain everything. But yeah, thank you.